Welcome to Margin Notes from the Central Church of Christ in Paducah, Kentucky. We're glad that you joined us for this latest video. As you can see on the screen, we'll be beginning the text of the book of Deuteronomy. But if this is your first time watching Margin Notes, this is actually the second video on the book of Deuteronomy. We did a shorter video, I believe it was about 13-14 minutes long, with some introductory material on Deuteronomy. As we said in that one, usually we do the introduction and then maybe a chapter or two, but since the first section of Deuteronomy, as you may recall, this is a series, basically a series of speeches that Moses gave. Since the first of those is the first 4 chapters, roughly, we decided to make the introductory video shorter, and then this video may be a little bit shorter than normal. There's actually quite a few notes to share with you. But just to kind of keep that outline going, that flow of the text going, we decided to make this video for chapters 1 through 4. As we always say, and if you watch these videos, you're sick of hearing it, I know, but we always want to encourage you to write these down elsewhere, maybe a notebook or a notepad, keep them on your computer somewhere, study them, evaluate them for yourself, and if you find them useful, then add them to the margin of your Bible or reword them. The Bible text is inspired, my notes aren't, but these are just things that I find helpful, and as I say, usually this is not all the notes I have on these texts. I keep some back for sermons and Bible classes and just some personal things with me, but these are some that I find helpful that maybe might encourage you in your study as well. So we'll dive in with the text of Deuteronomy. Again, the first 4 chapters we'll cover in this video. The book begins, and we're going to read the first 2 verses, even though verse 1 has a lot of names in it. But the book of Deuteronomy begins with these words. Chapter 1, verse 1. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness, in the Arabah opposite Suph. By the way, if you're a scripture reader at church, pray you never get assigned these verses. Between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab. And here's the key phrase. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. Now, as we often say in these videos, these are not meant to be sermons or Bible classes, but you may recall that Horeb, that verse 2 talks about, is another name for Sinai. That's where so much had happened in the middle chapters, or really the latter, 60% or so of the book of Exodus, the 10 Commandments given and so on in that book. And then Kadesh Barnea, the end of verse 2, is basically by the shores of the Promised Land. So the key phrase for this note is that phrase 11 days journey, or you may want to expand it out to it is 11 days journey. And the note that I have then is that is set here, meaning right at the outset of the book of Deuteronomy, to contrast, that should say with the book of Numbers. I just realized what I've typed there. I'm preaching through Nehemiah right now as I'm recording these, so I'm so used to typing that name. I promise in the margin of my Bible it says Numbers and not Nehemiah. I should say it's set here to contrast with the book of Numbers, not Nehemiah. But why it took 40 years to make this journey when it should have taken basically 11 days or thereabouts. Now probably 11 days journey would mean for a traveler or a small group, but when you're dealing with a huge nation, it might have taken a little more, but still, you're looking at weeks or at most months, not 40 years. And so that's why that little phrase is found at the beginning. And again, that should say Numbers. I apologize. That's when you have too many different things going on at the same time. Just realized that when I flipped the screen over and it said Nehemiah instead of Numbers. So the next note will come from chapter 1 and verse 7. And I've got 3 words on the screen before you because you have sort of a verse here with a lot of directions. The full verse says, "Turn and take your journey and go to the hill country of the Amorites, and to all their neighbors in the Arabah or Arabah, in the hill country, and in the lowland, and in the Negeb, and by the sea coast, the land of the Canaanites, and Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates." Now, there are a lot more phrases, or places, I should say, in this verse than the 3 that I've put on the screens. But I have notes beside these 3 to kind of talk about what they are, what these words are, what these places are. Here are the notes that I have. The Arabah or the Arabah is a rift in the vicinity of the Dead Sea, so basically the southern part of the Promised Land or nearby there. The lowland would be the land near the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, the verse kind of hints toward that a little bit, but specifically that's probably where the lowland would be. And then the Negev would be the southern portion of the Promised Land, the part of the land between hills and the desert. And so again, there are others there. The hill country I did mention by the sea coast would be fairly obvious. Where's the land of the Canaanites? And you can have notes for all of these, but those three I specifically have notes for. Where these things were found as they were told to go and be near the promised land and look at the promised land as far as what was going on here at the beginning of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 24 has another one of these place names. And they turned and went up into the hill country and came to the valley of Eshcol and spied it out. The valley of Eshcol, that note is, can literally be translated the valley of the bunch of grapes. And in this verse, or in this section really, from about verse 23 through 25, this is the only place name mentioned, or the only location mentioned, because Moses was reminding the people of the good of the land. These spies went to a lot of different places, but he specifically mentions the valley of the bunch of grapes, because he's telling them what they missed out on, but also what the previous generation, as I should say, missed out on, but now what they are looking forward to as they are preparing to go into the promised land. So that's the specific location he mentions. And that's one reason why verse 25 talks about the fruit of the land and the people saying that it is a good land that God was giving to them. That Moses mentioned this one specific place, the valley of Eshcol, the valley of the bunch of grapes. Deuteronomy 1 and verse 28, on the same page in our Bible. Let's read from verse 27 and 28. And you murmured in your tents and said, because the Lord hated us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt, to give us into the land of the Amorites to destroy us. Where are we going up? Our brothers have made our hearts melt. There's our key phrase, saying, the people are greater and taller than we. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven. And besides, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there. Now that phrase, made our hearts melt or make our hearts melt, is found a few times in the Old Testament. Not a ton, but a few. But the note that I have is another place, or a reference to another place that is mentioned, and how different things could have been if the people had not listened to the spies that are being reflected back on here from the book of Numbers. Again, not Nehemiah. And that is that made our hearts melt would have been the reaction of the enemies of God's people if God's people had just obeyed him. You see that phrase used in Joshua chapter 2 with Rahab, in Joshua chapter 5 in that same lead up to the fall of Jericho. And so this phrase, made our hearts melt, is meant to describe fear and those sorts of things. And here it is God's own people saying, our own kinsmen, our own brethren made our hearts melt because of bad report. But it would have been the reaction of the enemies of God's people if God's people had just done what God told them to do. Numbers chapter 2. And my pages are sticking together in the Bible. There we go. Numbers chapter 2 and verse 7. As Moses is talking about the time in the wilderness, you see the note on the screen, but the verse says, for the Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He knows you're going through this great wilderness. These 40 years the Lord your God has been with you. You have lacked nothing. Now, this may seem like a really obvious note, but it's one I just like to have, just to remind myself that one lesson they were to learn, these people were to learn in the wilderness, was contentment with God's provisions. That they would have lacked nothing. The end of the verse says, really, that whole verse talks about that, but the key phrase is the end there, you would have lacked nothing. Sometimes I think maybe we consider the wilderness wanderings was just punishment, and it was, but it was punishment to teach this next generation something. And one of those that they were to learn was, be content with what God gives you. You would have lacked nothing. And in fact, they did not lack anything. God gave them food to eat. He made sure they were safe, made sure their sandals didn't wear out, all those sorts of things. And so they were to be thankful for and content with the provisions or the blessings of God. Deuteronomy 2 and verse 23. Speaks of a group of people. In fact, in this section of Scripture, there's a lot of groups of people. But one of the groups of people mentioned there are the Caphtorim who came from Caphtor. And we go, well, okay, so what? Right? Who are these people? Well, likely, it seems to be a term for people of or near the sea. And that may be something that you don't care about or whatever. That's fine. But sometimes we have these groups of people that only mention a time or two in the Bible, and we think, well, why are they mentioning? What differentiates them from anybody else? And again, it seems likely. I looked at a few sources, and the ones I looked at were like, that's who these people probably were. We can't be 100% sure, but there's probably people of or near the sea. Um, but they had villages at Gaza, so they were in that part of the country. Um, but there were people who were of or near the sea that God's people were going to be interacting with, or did interact with, as they wandered in the wilderness. Again, that's one that just I like because it reminds me who these people are when I read this kind of strange name that just you don't read very often in the Bible. Well, there it is. That's probably who they were. Deuteronomy 2 and verse 33, near the end of that chapter. Verses 32 and 33 say, Then Sihon came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Jahaz, and the Lord our God gave him over to us, and we defeated him and his sons and all his people. The phrase for the note here is, the Lord our God gave him over to us. And what I have as a note at it is that this emphasis is on God's leading in victory even before they enter the promised land. They have been told when you go in the promised land, you're going all these victories and all this kind of stuff. This generation that's getting ready to go in is told the same thing later in the book. When you go in, you're going to be victorious. But here's a reminder of God led them in victory before they entered the promised land. He gave them a preview of what was to come if they would just have been faithful to Him. And so just a preview verse there that should have encouraged them to be more faithful if they would have simply followed through with what God had said in the wilderness and what they had seen God do through them and for them in the wilderness. Deuteronomy 3 and verse 11, very, very short word there to mark. This is a verse that talks about the bed of Og, and it's one of those verses that a lot of people know, and they're like, this is a strange fact about this guy. Verse 11, in fact, the English Standard Version has it in parentheses. It's just kind of a standalone phrase here. For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Arabah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. And so a lot of people go, wow, this guy was huge, or at least he had a huge bed. What's possible? But it's also possible that it's something else. Because the word bed literally means his resting place. And so instead of his bed, it could be describing his tomb or his sarcophagus, the place where his remains were. I'm not saying that's what it was. Either one is possible. But sometimes we kind of get this idea in our mind that, well, his bed was huge, and that is possible. But the Hebrew word just means resting place. And so it could be either one. It could have been his bed, or it could have been that he had died, or when he would die, that his tomb or his sarcophagus was this massive thing made of iron, or at least supported by being made of iron. And that would make a lot of sense as well. And so just something to consider there in this kind of odd verse. For some reason, a lot of people seem to remember, there's a guy in the Old Testament who has a huge bed. Who is that guy? I get asked that every once in a while. That's Og, and that's something about that sort of just verse that jumps out for some reason to a lot of people, including me. That's one of those things I remember as a kid. Like, there's somebody I read about it has a huge bed. Who was that guy? But there's something about it that may be just helpful to your study as you read through that text. Deuteronomy 3 and verse 29. The reason there's dots in between this is it's a fairly long phrase that I have marked in my Bible. Right at the end of that verse, in fact, it's the whole verse. So we remained in the valley opposite Beth Peor or Beth Peor. What I have in the margin of my Bible is that phrase where they remain becomes the scene or the backdrop, you can choose your word, for the remainder of the book of Deuteronomy, until obviously the very last chapter or so where Moses dies up on Mount Nebo. So that little phrase, we remained in the valley opposite Beth Peor, is the location setting. It's the scene for the rest of the book of Deuteronomy, where all this is happening, where Moses is giving these speeches to God's people. And so it's not just sort of a time marker, it's a place marker in the book that helps us to see what's going on. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 1 and verse 5, both have a word to mark. You may want to put something between them, or you may want to make this 2 notes or something. Verse 1, and now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the rules, so forth. And then in verse 5, see I have taught you statutes and rules as the Lord my God has commanded me, and so forth. What I have, and this people who've studied Hebrew are about to get really angry, and I'll explain it in just a second. What I have, I've marked the word listen and the word see. I've drawn a line between them, and I've written the word that these are interjections. Now, the reason I say people who say Hebrew probably get mad is, technically speaking, from what I'm told, there is no such thing as an interjection in Hebrew. In other words, that's an English thing, not a Hebrew thing. But what I mean by that is, this word listen in verse 1 and the word see in verse 5 serve in the way that we would use an interjection. Behold, look, wow, those sorts of things. If you watch Schoolhouse Rock back in the day, interjections was a great one. My son used to love that when he was a little kid. But the reason I have that marked in part also is because the one in verse 1 is part of the way through the verse. Usually we think of an interjection, right at the beginning of a statement. That's the way it is in verse 5. But in verse 1, the word listen is 5 words in to the verse, but it's still the command, the interjection that they were to perk their ears up and see what's getting ready to happen here. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 12. Speaking of where the people had seen what happened on Mount Sinai, looking back at that, Moses said in verse 12, "Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice." There's a lot of reasons we could go into. In fact, you could probably write a book if you really wanted to, as to why they only heard a voice, didn't see a form, and all that. But the note that I have, the very simple note I have beside that verse, is nothing. No, is that they would not have been tempted to. They would not have been tempted to make a form of God or make an idol of God. They saw no form, so it was nothing to make an image of God of. They didn't have something, oh, well, he looks like a cloud, or he looks like a human, or he looks like a goat or a cow or whatever. By seeing no form, there would be no temptation for them to make an idol. I don't know why I failed to put that note underneath that, but that's what it is there would be nothing to make an idol from, or there would be no form to make an idol from, to try to depict God in that way. Above the section that runs all the way from verse 15 through verse 35, and you see up there before verse 15, I have this written, that this whole section that starts in verse 15 of chapter 4 and goes all the way through verse 31 is a commentary on the second commandment. Don't make any graven images. Don't make any carved images. The English Standard Version above verse 15 has idolatry forbidden. That's part of it. But this is an extended divine commentary on a very, very simple command. And it just shows us how seriously God took that command. He takes all of them seriously. But that he would spend this long being this specific with a command that's very simple to understand. You shall not make any graven image. He will spend all this time making that commandment that clear. Should have been telling to his people in the Old Testament. The last note I have for you is, notice I've got several things on the screens. In verses 44 and 45, you have 4 words that are similar. They all mean not the same thing, but similar things. This is the law that Moses set before the people of Israel. These are the testimonies, the statutes, and the rules which Moses spoke to the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt. Now, some of that is just simply repetition for emphasis. In other words, he's using similar words to make a point. But each of these words means something, though similar, that still has a differentiation in it. So here's what I have beside them. The word law is a generic word. It's the word Torah, a word for teaching or law. The word testimonies specifically means covenant stipulations. This is what the covenant says. The word statutes, not statues, statutes that was a word for laws that were to be engraved or carved. Now, that could have been engraved or carved on stone or into leather or something, or it could have been engraved or carved into the hearts and minds of the people. But that's what the word itself actually meant. You see in there the idea of a statue, where that's something that's carved. Well, statute was a law that was engraved or carved. And then the word rules is just that, the rulings of a judge. Of course, in this case, the judge would be God. That he's the one who's making the rulings. He's the one setting the laws before the people. And so that's why, at least in part, you have those four very similar terms. They're all meant to emphasize the same thing, but just give a little bit different shade of meaning to each one of those things, just for the sake of emphasis as they went along, understanding these laws, testimonies, statutes, and rules that God gave through Moses. So we hope these notes have encouraged as we've gone through this first speech found in the book of Deuteronomy. And next time, Lord willing, we'll cover a bigger chunk from chapter 5 through, I believe it's chapter 13. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube video channel or the Facebook page. We release margin notes on both of those, and we hope each video encourages you. And we always want you to make sure that these videos encourage you to read the Bible, study the Bible, and live the Bible. Thanks for watching.